When you say I love you, what do you mean? When you hear someone else say I love you, what do you assume they mean? What does psychology as a field have to say about this word love? If you think of any group of people besides poets, psychologists would be those that would weigh in very strongly on this topic of love. So, on this week's episode of Perspectives on Life with Old Dr. D, we're going to talk about loving. So, as we're thinking about loving, we get to wonder about how we can begin to look at the construct and the phenomenon of love. We can do so egoistically, and we can do so phenomenologically. So, let's start off with the more egoistic and naturalistic way of looking at it. So, as I'm talking, my observations have been inspired by the research, what little research I've read on love in the field of psychology, and surprisingly, there's not a lot. Again, with how often issues of heartache and infatuation and crushing and loving, despair and grief once love is lost, given that those are such strong themes in the field of psychology, you think that the literature would be replete with what it is, what it means, how it functions, what it does, where it comes from, and where it goes. And alas, it is not. It's remarkable how little research there is compared to other topics there is on love. And so, oftentimes when psychologists talk about love in the literature, what I've noticed is they tend to assume two related philosophies, egoism and naturalism. So egoism is this idea that what we feel is ultimately about us. Even if my feelings are about you, I think they're about you. In actuality, it's also or ultimately about me. So therefore, if I say to somebody, oh, I love you, then that is a self-referential feeling. That I love you, meaning that the feeling of love exists inside of me, that you are the target of this love that is emanating from me, and that there is something about loving you that is hopefully pulling you towards me or doing something else like that, that this feeling exists within inside of me. Now, that's interesting because then what that does is it kind of challenges the notion that love is a shared phenomenon. And so when we look at love or when we assume love egoistically, you have person A who is feeling love and person B who is feeling love. And therefore, love exists inside of person A and inside of person B, but it doesn't exist inside of the relationship itself. It only exists inside the individuals. So this is a problem we have in psychology very often, is we aren't very good at measuring relationships. We can measure individuals in a relationship, but we can't really measure the relationship itself. One of the things that we find then is if we're bound within our bodies, then it is our feelings that dictate the feeling, the truthfulness, the nature of whatever it is that we're experiencing, whatever it is that we're encountering. And so oftentimes with egoism, we find this tendency in psychology to ascribe our motivations, the nature of our desire, the motivation around our desires, is that it is desire-based. Like loving becomes a desiring thing, and that it means that we are following the pleasure principle, right? Seeking after pleasure and avoiding pain. Because if the relationship does not exist as an entity that I can measure, that I can talk about, a loving relationship, therefore an individual has loving feeling. And that loving feeling then originates from them and within them. And so that becomes about them. It becomes self-serving. And so it's interesting how when I hear the writings of psychologists when they're talking about love, love is a self-serving process. And so as we're looking at this self-serving process, what we find is that love has a functional purpose, that love accomplishes certain work based on the individual's wants, needs, and desires. Because again, it's originated from within the person is the assumption of the field of many, within the field of psychology and for many psychologists. That love originates within the person is the assumption common in the field of psychology. So what are some of the functional purposes of love? Well, loving a sexual companion, that love is actually about personal pleasure. So therefore, if personal pleasure ends, so too does love. Loving a friend would be desiring platonic enjoyment, and that if that enjoyment ends, so too does love. Loving a family member, that love is about the sharing of goods, emotional goods, financial goods, temporal, physical resources, and that if that sharing ends, so too does love. That love is all about the ego, the individual ego, meeting their needs And insofar as those needs are not met, then the loving feeling ends, because the relationship does not serve the function of the feeling. So if love does not have a functional purpose, then the love does not exist and the love ends. So with egoism often comes the assumption of naturalism, that what we love is ultimately brought about by our genes. Who we love, how we love, what love even means, how we express love, is a genetic process due to years, millennia, millions of years of evolution, that it has created this phenomenon of survival of the fittest. Therefore, love has an evolutionary purpose, is the way some of my colleagues talk about loving. Like some talk about it as a functional purpose, like I mentioned under egoism, and some talk about it as a natural purpose. Well, what we think that we are doing when we are loving is actually serving the goals and ends of evolution. So if I love a sexual companion, then love is around procreative activities, procreative sex, procreative activities. So if a given partner is not evolutionarily advantageous, then love ends. There's also loving a friend, that love is now about social survival and social evolution. That if a friend or friendship group no longer provides advantage towards survival, then the love ends. Loving a family member. Love is just merely a manifestation of supporting one another's genes, that our genetic legacy as a family can continue. So therefore, if a family member is not actually biological family, then you can't love them like family. And then if you find out they're not biologically related, then love ends. So from an egoistic or evolutionary frame, the experience of love is either selfish, my loving is all about me and serves the function of meeting my wants, needs, and desires, or it's epiphenomenal, meaning that whatever loving feelings I think I'm having and whatever loving feelings I think I'm expressing and participating in, ultimately it is due to serve my genes. In either case, I note that psychologists are not actually researching love. They're researching pleasure or communication, or maybe someday they'll start researching genes. But love is neither pleasure nor genes. So where do we find the truthfulness of loving? Years ago, as a friend, neighborhood member, I got to know a couple of good friends. At the time they weren't good friends, they became good friends. And I hold up their relationship as a test for any theory about loving. Especially when I read these egoistic and naturalistic ways of describing love, or what love is and what it's for. There are some manifestations of loving that fit into that. There are some manifestations of love that don't. So when we look at functional love, how often is it that we see a relationship as no longer functioning the needs of someone, and therefore they disengage from that particular relationship? A romantic sexual partnership, where one of the partners is no longer sexually interested or able, and the relationship ends. Right? The dead bedroom phenomenon, for example. Or in friendship, when people stop enjoying one another's company, that the friendship ends. For who we used to be close to is no longer. And then familial relationships, right? If my family is not serving the functions and ends and meeting my needs emotionally, material, etc., then I'm no longer part of that family. I no longer consider them a part of me. There is no relationship there. But when I met these friends, it became clear to me that there is something more to love and to loving than the egoistic ways we psychologists often think about it. As husband and wife, small kids, she had been rendered medically disabled, through a botched surgery, and lived in constant pain, was very weak. Much of her GI tract had been removed. And when I would visit them and when I would hang out with them, even though she could rarely come out into the living room to associate with me, she would weakly holler from the bedroom, which was right there by the living room. She would send me texts, and we would chat by text message, sometimes when I was sitting on her couch. And her husband would come out, and we would have long conversations. And he was doting and caring for her. And she was doting and caring for him in her limited capacity. That there were so many things about normal relationships that they were very much deprived of. In it, to watch the tenderness with which he cared for her, the compassion with which she responded, that their love was dysfunctional, it was non-functional in the usual married romantic partner sense of the word love, and instead seemed to be something more than what psychology can offer us at times. Now, I'm not talking an individual psychologist. I know psychologists are very romantic people, very loving in a familial or platonic way. Our research, though, as much as illuminates, can also conceal the nature of loving. And so every time I read a new idea or a theory of love, I hold it up to this particular couple. Her medical issues were sufficiently acute. She passed away not too long ago. And now I watch the love and grief, quietly and from a distance. And none of the articles in the research of psychology help to comfort, soothe, illuminate, or understand the depth of that love, the intensity of the grief. So we turn to poetry, some of us. We write poetry, we read poetry. And so here's a couple of poems that we get to consider. I am not yours, not lost in you. Not lost though I long to be, lost as a candle lit at noon, lost as a snowflake in the sea. You love me and I find you still, a spirit beautiful and bright, yet I am I who long to be lost as a light is lost in light. Oh, plunge me deep in love, put out my senses, leave me deaf and blind, swept by a tempest of your love, a taper in the rushing wind. It's by Sarah Teasdale. Very different expression of the same feeling in some way. This poem. I carry your heart with me. I carry it in my heart. I am never without it. Everywhere I go, you go, my dear, and whatever is done by only me is your doing, my darling. I fear no fate, for you are my fate, my sweet. I want no world, for beautiful you are my world, my true. And it's you, and whatever a moon has always meant, and whatever a sun will always sing is you. Here is the deepest secret nobody knows. Here is the root of the root, and the bud of the bud, and the sky of the sky, and a tree called life, which grows higher than a soul can hope or a mind can hide. And this is the wonder that's keeping the stars apart. I carry your heart. I carry it in my heart. By E. E. Cummings. So, with poetry, we can see these expressions of love. They can give us goosebumps, melt our hearts, water our eyes, inform our desire to reach out to those we love, to hold them, to write to them, to speak to them, to connect. Pius de Morados, a philosopher, talks about the phenomenology of human love, these ways of thinking about loving a little bit differently than a psychologist. Some overlap, some are a little bit different. So with romance, he says, many of us have the tendency to equate love with romance, the feeling of excitement, desire, fantasy. He says, sometimes what love means is possession. Love is an act of possessing or being possessed by another person. People might struggle in the name of love. I love you has come to mean you are mine. I want you to do things I want. I want you to be what I want you to be. Or else it has come to mean I am yours and you can do whatever you want to me insofar as I get to possess you. Infatuation. Love is to be attracted with the good qualities of the other. Love is blind and lovers do not see. Love has been equated with admiration. To see somebody without all of their flaws and faults and to only see them in that way. And then he also writes, sex. Love has become synonymous with sex for many young people. To love another means to be passionately attracted to them, to bring them to bed with me. And so romance, possession, infatuation, and sex. And yet when I think of my friends, yes, there's romance, in a way. Possession, not really. Infatuation, long past, through years of medical trauma. And sex. So there's a couple of perspectives of my own I'd like to share with you about what loving means. We'll get into some more detail in a moment. Love, in my very biased way, is not a feeling but an endeavoring. A consistent valuing of the other, taking them as they are, and holding their essence as sacred. This compassion and acceptance for the other, as exercised and as practiced, you see now, that is loving. And this love, as you notice, is an endeavoring. It is an effortful one. At times when we try to exercise our compassion and acceptance for the other, even though they're making it hard, that is when the endeavoring is effortful. And sometimes we forget to do it because the loving of the other is so easy that the endeavoring falls away and familiarity breeds contempt. And so therefore we can remind ourselves to endeavor to love others, to love our lover, to love our family, to love our friends, that this is an endeavoring. Love, from my philosophical points of view, require two simultaneous processes, and that's closeness and distance. Closeness with the other. Closeness is I can get close enough to you to see how magnificent you are, as well as to see your flaws, to be close enough to behold you in detail, that when I'm accepting, the person that I'm accepting is you, and that I am getting you, that my compassion and affection for you is such that it is about you in a way that is authentic and real, because I am close enough to you to get you, at least approximately. At the same time, though, there is also distance required. Because am I collapsing you into merely an extension of my desire? Have I collapsed the other you into the same me? Have I violated who and what you are by taking you in and making you be what I want you to be in my head, in my soul, rather than allowing there to be distance? That I is not thou, and thou art not I, and that by seeing you distantly, that you are not merely an extension of my desire. You are not merely an extension of my intent. Instead, you are somebody who is taken up as they are, fully and richly over time. So that simultaneity of closeness enough to know who it is that we are loving and how it is to love them, as well as distant enough that they retain their identity that is not ours. So when we use the word love, what do we mean? So there are 7 senses of the word love that we're going to talk about today. Eros, storge, phileo, ludus, pragma, philautia, and agape. And so we'll take each one of these in turn. So Eros is commonly referred to when we look at Pius Murado's philosophies of love, the phenomenology of love, which we talked about a moment ago, that a lot of what he is talking about is eros, this passionate love, this possessive love, this sexual love, this being madly in love. There's this feeling sometimes of a loss of control, this feeling of fear, that this love can be intense and exciting, it can be possessive, that sometimes when we feel ourselves falling this particular love, it can be very scary for us because we don't want to fall in love. Sometimes we feel attracted to those that we don't wish to feel attracted to, that we find ourselves fantasizing about them at times when there are other things we'd rather be concentrating about. And at other times we throw ourselves into the desire, that we think and fantasize about them, and it becomes this exercise that we greatly enjoy. When I'm talking to various people through time, and they'll talk to me about how they're not sure about the status of their current relationship, they'll talk about how the spark is gone, that they no longer feel that hot and burning excitement, that the sparks of attraction, those kind of things have faded, and they worry about whether or not they're actually in love with their partner. Well, sometimes what this is confusing all love with just eros. And this particular manifestation of the feeling like you've got a crush and you're Twitter-pated when you see the person, you're thinking about them a lot when they're not around, that lasts for a little while in relationships. This is a stage of love that a colleague of mine taught me is limerence. Limerence is that crushing on feeling. It's that feeling of excitement about the other person. It's the desiring them and fantasizing about them in various ways. And limerence doesn't last very long on average. In fact, limerence can, by the end of the first year, it can be well and thoroughly faded. Now, don't get me wrong. I would argue that limerence is something that we can keep sparking up from time to time. Like for those of you that are in long-term committed relationships, flirt, date, look for reasons, grab that ass. That's something that when we were younger, when my sweetheart would walk up the stairs in front of me, couldn't keep my hands off of her backside. And so I'd be pinching her a little bit or caressing her a little bit. And so she would hold her hands between me and her butt as she'd run up the stairs. And now, we're middle-aged, neither of us are running upstairs anytime soon. But it's really fun because now she'll wiggle her butt a little bit. And so I can just pinch her, we tease each other and laugh, right? That's a way to keep that little spark of limerence alive. So, one of the things that Pius Morados observes is that for younger people, love has been collapsed into sex. And we'll have a video here soon on loving in platonic ways. Like, how do we navigate friendship when there's also a spark of attraction there? Like, how do we navigate that? Because there are so many ways of loving in addition to erotic loving. And there are ways in which erotic loving can inform other ways of loving, and vice versa, in a way that are healthy and authentic and appropriate to everyone involved. But that's another video. So today we have eros. Passionate, desiring love can be possessive and often is. But that's not it. There's also storge. Now, I'm not Greek. Well, at least not ancient Greek. And so therefore I could be mispronouncing some of these words. And if so, wonderful. Right? So storge is an empathy bond. It is an empathy bond that grows over time. It's what some ancient thinkers called the natural affection. This is the natural affection of people who are thrown into a situation together, right? Usually the hazard of biology, a parent and child, sibling with sibling, that these are people who have come up together, that these are the natural affections of people who are in close association over time. So this particular form of love, storge, involves this kind of affection and empathy and connection and habit. There's a lot of things that go into storge that it is layered sometimes. Like, I'm thinking of some of my relationships with my siblings, for example, and how fond I am of them. And the way in which, now that I'm middle-aged and I'm looking back in our lives, the way in which I would compensate for them and they would compensate for me growing up. Our habits, our preferences, our likes and dislikes, the way in which we would come up together. For example, I have a sister who is very sensitive to sound. And so we learned at a young age to chew with our mouths closed, because if we were to chew with our mouths open and make that smacking sound, it would really upset her. And it was very lovely. I was having dinner with a friend the other day, and he was chewing with his mouth open a little bit, making a little bit of smacking sound, and I felt myself wincing, like I'm an extension of my sister's preferences, right? That we all learned to eat very quietly because of her dislike of certain sounds. And now I carry on that tradition of disliking certain sounds, even though that's not where and how it started. Likewise, I tend to be the more extroverted one in my family. Right? Some of my siblings are very quiet, so in social settings, I found myself at a young age going out and breaking the ice. But likewise, many of my siblings are wiser than I and less impulsive, and so therefore I came to rely on their wisdom to compensate for my lack thereof at times. Now, with Storge, there is not the claim that just because you are biologically related to someone means that there is love there. No, love is an endeavoring, right? Love is a process that we participate in. It requires that simultaneity of closeness and distance. That there are those who are biologically related who don't care for one another, or who actively abuse or betray, then that is not Storge. And a process of abuse that I've seen time and time again through the years is when people will make a claim to, but we're family, as a vehicle to exploit or abuse someone else. Storge is not abusive or exploitative. So Storge is the natural affection that comes about through long affiliation. Now, a Draperism is there are three types of family. There's the family you have, there's the family you make, and there's the family you choose. So the family you have is the family that you were born into or adopted into, right? This is the family that you are given by the world. And this particular family is not necessarily loving. Oftentimes it is, and I hope it would be. But of the family that you have, some of those relationships work out in loving ways, and some of them don't. I hope those of you who are listening, most of your relationships have turned out to be very loving, that the family you have is a loving family more often than not. But at the same time, though, there's an intentionality that's required of that there are relationships that you need to make happen, and other people need to cooperate in making that happen. And so therefore, this would be the family you make. So of the family I have, which ones do I actually endeavor loving with? That I endeavor Storge with? Am I associating with my parents? Am I kind to them? Are they kind to me? Am I associating with my siblings? Are we kind to one another? My cousins, etc. That are we connecting around this? Are we actually participating in Storge intentionally? That's the family you make. And then there's the family you choose. This is a Draperism for those people who are like parent figures for you that are not biologically related, or siblings that are not biologically related, your friends who become brother or sister for you and to you because of your long association and the depth and commitment of your relationship. So there's the family you have, the family you make, and the family you choose. All of that falls under the umbrella of Storge. Now there's Phileo, or philia. This is deep friendship. This is when Aristotle talks about Platonic love and the Platonic ideal of love. This is phileo, or philia. This is the love born in the trenches of difficulty at times, the way in which people can be bonded together like brothers or sisters in arms or siblings in arms through great trial and great difficulty. When you're at work and you have a very difficult boss and that brings you closer together, that would be a way to forge this phileo very quickly. Likewise, it can also be love born of fun, being a part of the same team with somebody for a long period of time, sharing hobbies for a long period of time, that as we begin to associate with one another and we can become real and authentic with one another, both who and what we are and in relation at the same time, then lo and behold, that is this Platonic ideal where we can accept and care for and help one another, knowing one another and who we really are. Friend love, the BFF love, the Platonic ideal. Now, it's not it. It's not all. It's still going. Another one is Luthos. Luthos is playful love, spontaneous affection and love. The other day, for example, we were at a hot wings and beer place. And I was there because I heard the wings were really good. For those of you that know me personally, I'm not really big on drinking much alcohol at all. And so as we're hanging out and as we're talking, they came and they put us, the bar staff came and put us in trivia teams. I was just there to eat hot wings. And so they asked us to move around tables, etc. Apparently I'd come during this event, and it's a regular event at that particular establishment. So trying to be a good neighbor, I take my wings over and sit down, and I'm with my sweetheart and a group of 4 other people, and they start playing barroom trivia, sports and politics and things like that. And after a few minutes, we get to know each other's names, we're laughing, we're joking together, and for a period of time, there was that playful love that we shared, where inside jokes started to come about. We had a very quick sense of other people's strengths and weaknesses. I am near unto useless when it comes to sports trivia. However, when it comes to American history trivia, I'm okay, right? When it comes to certain pop culture trivia, I'm okay, right? And so this playful love is like the frivolity of, friendly chats, meeting somebody new at a club or bar, dancing with strangers at a celebration. We were at a wedding not too long ago, and I was feeling well enough that we got in the crowd, and next thing you know, I'm dancing with this person and back to my sweetie and back to this person and then with another person, and it was just laughing and fun. Likewise, I saw a great example of Lulu's the other day. I was sitting, in my car not too far from a park, and I look over and there are children at play and their moms are watching them. And as a child comes down the slide, another child catches them and they hug each other. And these were like little 3, 4-year-olds, and it was so cute and so lovely. And so as they were walking by a minute later, the moms, they had just barely met, and they met through their kids, and their kids are now best friends and will likely never see each other again. That's Lulu's. That's this playful affection. When you're in bed and tickling your beloved, when you're joking with a friend, that's Lulu's. Pragma. Pragma, this is the long-standing, mature love. This is the love of when 2 trees grow together and end up sharing roots. This is the, joke of why it is that when people get old together, they end up looking alike. It's because they grow together, that 2 become 1. This is the love of conversations held in absolute silence due to long, deep, and intimate familiarity with one another. This is the way in which 2 couples or a couple, 2 partners can walk together hand in hand, and you can see the lifetime of shared experience that joins them at the fingertips. Pragma. When I look over at my wife and I see the young woman I married, and I see the wrinkles, and I see what they represent. Pragma. Philautia. This is love of self. This is not narcissism. I want to be very clear. Like Narcissus staring in the water at his own reflection. It's not self-aggrandizement. It's not conceit. This is self-acceptance, self-compassion. This is the way in which we can accept ourselves enough that when we engage with and interact with other people, we don't insert our insecurities into that relationship because we accept that we have our insecurities. Now, you notice the way I phrased that. I didn't say that we are without insecurities. It's that we go, oh, I'm feeling a little insecure about that. We accept that we're feeling a little insecure, and we don't let it get in the way of this particular relationship, whether it be eros or phileo or storge, etc., that we are accepting, that we exercise self-compassion. So philautia, this love of self, is not narcissism. In fact, it can be quite the opposite. It is this feeling that some people give off, and you've probably experienced this from some people, where they are comfortable in their own skin, and therefore they can encounter you in yours, and they don't get in the way of that. They don't talk themselves out of connecting with you or make themselves a problem. They tend not to apologize for who they are because they realize that they are who they are, warts and all, and they're comfortable in their skin, and therefore they can be comfortable to touch yours. Philautia. And then, last but far from least, agape. This is the radically accepting compassion, the gift of love for others, whether friend, family, familiar, or a stranger. This is the willingness to sacrifice of self for the sake of others that transcends even the thought of reciprocity. When you buy lunch for a friend and you forget to keep track of it, even though you're tight on cash too, that was agape. All the way up to donating a kidney for somebody who needs it. Right? When you're busy, you're caught in traffic, and somebody else needs to get in, and you hit the brake a little bit. That's a little whisper of agape to let somebody into traffic when you're also in a hurry. So it's this interesting love that is compassion, which is this motivated empathy, right? That it is this love that you have for another, that you don't demand reciprocity, they don't need to return that love. You do not seek to own somebody in that love. It is radically non-possessive. It is a very powerfully liberating love, that when you love somebody with agape, you want them to be out there being them in the richness of their being, and you savor their connections. You love it when they are loving, and you don't demand any of it. That with agape comes the radical freedom of others to be who they are, and you do not seek to hold or to possess or to constrain or to restrain. Instead, it is a celebration inherently deep in your soul for the inherent worth and existence of the other. Agape is the only of these loves that doesn't seek after its own. And it is unconditional. Whether the other one returns the love, lives the love, not, none of that matters. They are always already loved, if the feeling is agape. I worry sometimes that agape is fading in the world. And I'm grateful every time I see little notes of kindness, little notes of compassion. I'm aware it's not dead. So, a group of us were talking a few years ago about, well, what is true love then? We've got all of these loves, right? Phileo and Storge and Eros and Ludus and all of these loves. Like, what makes for true love? And one I would say is true love is when the endeavoring is mutual. There's a couple of poems I wrote about that. We'll upload some of that poetry on another date. But some of my colleagues in that particular discussion argued that what makes love true is taking any one of these loves and combining it with agape. That if, for example, you're in a romantic relationship, where you would sacrifice for the other and not possess them, where you celebrate them and help them grow without demanding that they conform to your desire, that when you love somebody this passionately, like imagine a tree, that you do not turn it into a bonsai tree where you're clipping and warping and wiring so it looks exactly the way it wants, or that this person, this love stays connected to you in a particular way. Instead, it is fertilizing and watering that love, and wherever it may grow, if it grows towards you or grows apart, that even though you are excited by them and you're attracted to them, that you also get to let them be who they are, even if it grows away from you. Hopefully it will grow towards, but there was no demand for that love to do so. So true siblinghood, right, involves that agape. Are we willing to sacrifice and serve? Do we even think of it as sacrifice and service, right? Do we demand that it be sacrificed and served? Well, that just kind of eroded agape by making it a demand. But is that mutual endeavoring of kindness and self-sacrifice towards one another? Likewise with friendship. Are we there for one another? Is that what makes the Platonic ideal really ideal? Is that unpossessiveness of no longer seeking or demanding? One of my concepts with friendship is I've noticed that I've got friends who I talk to frequently, and then through the hazard of time and place and culture, they end up moving away for a while, and we don't talk for a month or a year. And then next thing you know, they're back in town, or we connect one at a conference or at an event, and the conversation picks right up where it left off. That even though I have friends right now all over the world, that as I sit and I feel this, they still matter to me, and they're still my friends. Even if we haven't spoken in a year or two, that they're still there and they still matter, right? That it doesn't need to be that immediate possessed, you are my friend and we need to see each other all the time for you to be my friend. Instead, when we add agape to it, once a friend, always a friend. And yeah, they still matter. So again, agape is the radical acceptance and compassion for the other or others for their own sake and in their own context of being. It's our actions for their sake. It's not self-serving. That agape, I understand, can be practiced to the point where it just becomes this caring, compassionate, habitual generosity for others. That at times when you are needed, you just are there by instinct almost. And again, that requires the simultaneity of distance and closeness. There's also the issue of make ends and constituent ends when we wonder about what love is true. Another friend of mine brought this up, and I apologize, my friends, I can't remember which one brought this up in this particular dialogue, but I was captivated by the notion. So, make ends are when we engage in a particular behavior to accomplish certain things that we want or need. And so, therefore, if I'm loving in a certain way, making love, for example, then it is to accomplish a certain goal of meeting a need or desire. Whereas constituent ends are activities that we engage in for their own sake, and there is no want, need, or desire that we're intending to fulfill. So, therefore, if my love is making something, right, that I'm making something possible that fulfills me temporarily, then that can be loving. It's also not necessarily true love, according to this argument of my colleagues. Whereas constituent ends is more likely to be true love. That is where we are engaging in loving for its own sake, because it is a constituent end in and of itself. So, for those of you that are in partnered relationships, date. Find out activities in common that you can do with your beloved and do it. Not because you're hoping to get laid at the end of the evening, although that would be lovely if both of you are in the mood. And instead, it's because this is what people in committed relationships do. That these are activities you engage in for their own sake, because you care for one another. That it is manifest in that relationship as these regular activities. It also makes me think of what perfect really means. Perfect love. So, in the religious tradition I was raised in, perfection, I was mistaught at times, meant flawlessness. You had to be perfect in order to be loved by other people and to be loved by God. And then later, I learned that what perfect really means is whole and complete. And then in my young adulthood, I was shaken to my core when I found out that the concept of perfect is a relational event. For example, those of you who have hung out with me personally, you know I tend to be creative and absent-minded, and sometimes I lose details. And so therefore, it's incumbent for me to team up with and partner up with people in my family, with my sweetheart, with my dear friends, that we connect together, that there are things they're good at that I'm not, and together, more power to do good in the world becomes possible. So, for example, I am somewhat blind to myself. For all of my insight, I don't get to see every corners of my soul. And sometimes some friends of mine call me out on it. Like just the other day, out with a friend on a Friday morning breakfast, and I'm eating my oatmeal, and I was lamenting a particular thing, a particular situation I was stuck in at work, and she just looks at me over her breakfast sandwich and called me right out on my lack of insight and my own lack of accountability for my own behavior. And it was very kind, it was very loving, and it shook me a bit. That her ability to see in me what I was blind to in myself made us better friends, not only in that moment, but in perpetuity. So, for example, here at home, my wife is much better at details than I am. I am very good at bringing in energy and dynamism and creativity. I will plan an event, for example, or better yet, I'll have an idea for an event. Like, we used to do these big pig roasts here in my house. We would roast entire hogs in my backyard, and it was a full day celebration. It was quite the event. And I would have an idea to do that, but I would totally be lost on the details of how to make that happen. And so therefore, my long-suffering sweetheart would go, okay, we need to figure out how much the pig's going to weigh. We're going to need to build the infrastructure to make that happen. How are we going to handle invitations? And I had plenty of energy to help with all of that, but she thought of many of these details that wouldn't even cross my mind to think about, right? And so likewise, I've noticed that in relationships with other people, that their strengths complement my weaknesses and my weaknesses their strengths. That perfect isn't I have to be good at everything. It's that together we are good at everything. The more and more people we love, the more and more people that are together with us, the more and more possibilities for us to be good in the world are made manifest, to be loving. I've noticed that there are times when my kids need some comfort and they come to old dad for some forms of comfort. They go to mom for other kinds. Likewise, I've noticed I've got friends when I have a practical thing that needs to be fixed. There are certain friends I go to, and there are other friends I go to when I need a shoulder to cry on. That's where perfection comes from. That perfection is wholeness. If I'm 100% Matt and you are 100% you, if we team up, it's like 300% of possibility comes into the world in a loving way. That requires some philautia, you'll notice, that we get to know and be aware of what our strengths and weaknesses are. And it also requires eros and like romantic love and friendly love in some relationships, friendly love and familial love in other relationships, just friendly love and still others. That when we are that self-accepting, then we know how to compensate and engage with other people, their strengths with our weaknesses, and vice versa. That maybe what true love is the perfect love, in the sense that without shame, people can come together and care for one another and others around them. Next time you say, I love you, think to yourself what it means. What do you mean by it? And when you hear love from other people, I hope now that you'll think that there's 7 different possibilities now. And many of these loves intermix quite lovely. Some don't, some do. And so therefore you get to wonder about when somebody says, I love you. This has been a real journey for me. I was raised in a rather stoic home. And so as I started, in high school, when my friends would say, I love you, it was kind of jarring at first as a 16-year-old, especially when there was a spark of attraction for someone. And then I learned to settle into it. Like dating my sweetheart's family. When I first met one of her aunts, I'd never met her before, and weren't big on hugs in my family growing up. And her aunt came up, quite a tall person, and she hugged me around the ribs, and I felt my back pop. And I learned to lean into those hugs. That there are all of these ways to be loving. So yeah, now you get to think about it. The way these loves inform one another, the way they relate to one another, and in loving ways you relate to others. We get to wonder if our love is true, if it is constituent, and if it is perfect. So, thank you again for joining me on this episode of Perspectives on Life with Old Dr. D. Thank you.